Princess Valara Kethrian had never seen a human up close until the day her ship exploded in the cold darkness of space. And she found herself falling toward a planet she had been taught to hate since childhood. The Ithri Empire stretched across 1,000 star systems, and her people had walked among the galaxies for over 40,000 years before humanity had even learned to make fire on their small blue world. Valara was the third daughter of Emperor Kethrian IX, a man whose blood carried the legacy of conquerors and scholars who had shaped the very fabric of interstellar civilization. She had grown up in crystal palaces that floated above purple clouds, surrounded by servants who anticipated her every need and tutors who filled her mind with the knowledge of ages. And always, she had been told that humans were dangerous primitives who had somehow clawed their way into space through violence and luck rather than wisdom and patience. Her people had silver skin that shimmered like moonlight on water, and their eyes held the deep violet color of nebulae. They lived for nearly 1,000 years and could touch the minds of others with their thoughts. Humans, by contrast, were short-lived, creatures of flesh and blood who burned through their brief existence with a reckless energy that the Ithri found both terrifying and distasteful. Vela had been traveling to a diplomatic conference when the raiders struck without warning. Her royal transport was a marvel of Ithri engineering, but the ambush was perfectly executed by enemies who knew exactly where to find her. Plasma fire tore through the ship's shields, and within moments, everything Valara had known was burning around her. Her guards died trying to protect her, their silver blood staining the white floors of the vessel as they fell one by one. The last thing Valara remembered was the escape pod launching automatically, carrying her unconscious body toward the nearest habitable world, while her ship became a tomb of fire and twisted metal behind her. She woke to pain and confusion and the rough feeling of bandages wrapped around her arms and chest. The ceiling above her was made of wood, actual wood from trees, and the air smelled of strange herbs and smoke. For a moment, she thought she had somehow traveled back in time to some primitive age. Then a face appeared above her, and she saw her first human. He was perhaps 30 years old by human counting, with brown hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of Earth's forests. His skin was a warm brown tone, and there were small lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. Though he was not smiling now, he looked at her with an expression of concern and curiosity, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "You're awake," he said in the common galactic tongue that all spacefaring species shared. "I was worried you might not make it through the night, but you're tougher than you look." Valara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain shot through her body like lightning. "Do not touch me," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Do you have any idea who I am, you primitive creature?" The human raised an eyebrow, but did not seem offended by her words. "I'm Danny Carter," he said calmly. "I'm the medic for this settlement, and right now, I'm the person who pulled you out of a wrecked escape pod and spent 6 hours keeping you alive. So maybe we can save the insults for after you've healed." Valara stared at him with fury burning in her violet eyes. How dare this human speak to her as though they were equals? How dare he put his hands on her royal person? She opened her mouth to demand that he summon someone of higher authority, someone who would understand the gravity of hosting Ithri royalty. But then she looked around the small room and realized the terrible truth of her situation. This was not a city or even a proper town. The wooden walls, the simple furniture, the handmade curtains on the single window, all of it spoke of a frontier settlement far from civilization. She was stranded on a human colony world with no way to contact her people and no one who would recognize her status. "Where am I?" she asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded. "New Horizon," Danny replied as he checked the bandages on her arm. "It's a farming colony on the edge of settled space, population about 300. and the nearest major city is on the other side of the planet about 2,000 miles east. So you're going to be stuck with us primitives. For a while, Valara felt something. Cold settled in her chest. Her ship was destroyed her. Guards were dead. She was alone on an alien world surrounded by the very species she had been raised to despise, and this human, this Danny Carter, had saved her life. She did not know how to feel about that. "I need to contact my people," she said, trying to sound commanding despite her weakness. "The Aethery Empire will send ships to retrieve me once they know my location." Danny nodded slowly, and something flickered across his face that she could not quite read. "We have a communication relay in town," he said. "Once you're strong enough to walk, I'll take you there. But that's going to be at least a week. Maybe 2, so for now, you should rest. I do not take orders from humans." Valara snapped. Danny stood up and walked toward the door of the small room. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at her with an expression that was neither angry nor hurt, just tired in a way that seemed to go deeper than physical exhaustion. "You're free to leave whenever you want," he said quietly. "The door's not locked, and I won't stop you. But the next settlement is 300 miles through wilderness full of predators that would love to meet an injured traveler. So I'd suggest you swallow that pride for a few days and let yourself heal." He left without waiting for a response. And Valara lay in the simple bed surrounded by the smell of strange herbs. Listening to the sounds of an alien world through the thin wooden walls, she could hear voices outside. Humans talking and laughing as they went about their daily lives. She could hear children playing some kind of game that involved a lot of shouting and running. She could hear the wind moving through trees and the calls of birds. She did not recognize everything was wrong. Everything was primitive and rough, and so far beneath what she deserved as a princess of the Aethery Empire. And yet Danny Carter had saved her life without asking anything in return. He had touched her with gentle hands and spoken to her without fear or worship. He had treated her as though she were just another person who needed help. Valara did not understand. Human, she did not understand this world or this situation or the strange feeling in her chest that might have been gratitude if she had been willing to admit such a thing. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, telling herself that she would endure this nightmare for as long as necessary and then return to her proper place among the stars. She had no way of knowing that New Horizon would change everything she believed about herself and about the strange, short-lived species called humanity. She had no way of knowing that Danny Carter would become the most important person she had ever met. All she knew was that she was alone and afraid and far from home. And somewhere in the small wooden house, a human was making tea and humming a song she did not recognize. The first night on New Horizon was the longest of Princess Valara's life, but it was only the beginning. The days passed slowly in New Horizon, and Valara found herself trapped in a world she did not understand. Danny Carter visited her twice each day to check her wounds and change her bandages, and each time she treated him with cold silence or sharp words, designed to remind him of his place. He never responded with anger or hurt feelings. He simply did his work with steady hands and left her alone to stare at the wooden ceiling and curse her fate. By the 5th day, she was strong enough to walk, and Danny offered to show her around the settlements. She wanted to refuse, but the small room had become a prison, and her curiosity about these strange creatures was growing despite her best efforts to ignore it. New Horizon was nothing like she had expected. The Aethery taught that human settlements were places of chaos and violence, where the strong took from the weak and everyone lived in fear. But as Valara walked through the dusty streets with Danny at her side, she saw something very different. She saw a woman named Martha, who ran the general store and gave free food to families who could not afford to pay. She saw a man named Samuel who spent his afternoons teaching children to read under the shade of a great tree. She saw neighbors helping neighbors build houses and repair fences and harvest crops from fields that belonged to the whole community. Rather than any single person, why do they share so much? Valara asked one afternoon as she watched a group of humans working together to raise the frame of a new barn. Danny looked at her with surprise, as though the answer should have been obvious, because that's how you survive out here. He said simply, no one makes it alone on the frontier. So we take care of each other, and when someone needs help, we give it without keeping score. Valara thought about the crystal palaces of her homeworld, where servants competed for favor, and nobles plotted against each other in endless games of power and status. She thought about how her own sisters had barely spoken to her except when politics required it. She thought about how alone she had always felt, even when surrounded by thousands of people who called themselves her family. These humans had so little compared to the ethery, and yet they seemed to have something her people had lost long ago. Danny put her to work in his clinic, and at first she was outraged by the idea that a princess should perform manual labor, but he ignored her protests and handed her a stack of bandages that needed rolling. And somehow she found herself doing the task rather than continuing to argue. She learned that Danny had come to New Horizon 8 years ago with his wife and young daughter. His wife had been a teacher named Lucy, and his daughter had been a bright little girl named Sophie, who loved to collect flowers and ask endless questions about the stars. Valara learned this not from Danny himself, but from Martha at the general store, who told the story with sad eyes and a gentle voice. 3 years ago, a plague had swept through the colony. It was a simple disease by ethery standards, something their medical technology could cure in a matter of hours, but the ethery did not share their knowledge with humans. And so the plague had burned through New Horizon like wildfire. Lucy and Sophie had been among the first to fall ill. And despite everything Danny did, despite all his skill and all his desperate prayers, he could not save them. He had buried them on a hill overlooking the settlement. And he had never stopped working to save others, even when his heart was broken beyond repair. When Valara heard this story, she felt something twist painfully in her chest. She thought about the ethery medical archives that contained cures for 10,000 diseases. She thought about the debates in her father's court where humans were dismissed as too primitive to deserve such gifts. She thought about how easy it would have been to save Lucy and Sophie and all the others who had died, and how her people had chosen to let them suffer instead. That night, she found Danny sitting alone outside his house, looking up at the stars with an expression she could not read. She sat down beside him without speaking, and for a long time they simply watched the sky together. Why did you save me? She finally asked. You know what my people did. You know we could have helped during the plague but chose not to. So why did you pull me from that wreckage? Danny was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and tired, but not angry, because letting someone die for what their government did isn't justice. He said, it's just cruelty wearing a different mask. And I've seen enough cruelty to last me a lifetime. Valara did not know what to say to that. She had been raised to believe that humans were simple creatures driven by anger and revenge. But this man had lost everything because of her people's indifference, and he had still chosen to save her life. I do not understand you, she admitted quietly. Danny laughed, but it was a gentle sound without mockery. That's okay, he said. Most days I don't understand myself either, but I figure the universe is complicated enough without me adding more hate to it. As the weeks passed, Valara found herself changing in ways she could not have predicted. She helped in the clinic without being asked, and she discovered that she liked the feeling of making someone's pain go away. She learned the names of the children who played in the streets, And she began to smile when they waved at her. She ate dinner with Martha and Samuel and their 3 sons. And she laughed at jokes that would have seemed crude, and beneath her just months ago she was still an ethery princess. Still a being who would live for centuries, while everyone around her grew old and died. But somewhere along the way, New Horizon had started to feel less like a prison and more like something she did not have a word for. One evening, Danny asked her about her homeworld, and she found herself describing the crystal palaces and the purple clouds and the endless libraries filled with the knowledge of ages. She told him about her sisters and her father, and the cold formality of royal life. She told him things she had never told anyone, and he listened without judgment or interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that would stay with her forever. "Sounds lonely," he said simply. Valora felt tears prick at her eyes, and she did not know why. No one had ever seen through her like that before. No one had ever looked past the titles and the power and the privilege to see the lonely girl who had spent her whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from her. "It was," she whispered, and the admission felt like setting down a weight she had not known she was carrying. Danny nodded and handed her a cup of tea, and they sat together in comfortable silence while the stars wheeled overhead. Valara did not know it yet, but she was falling in love with this small settlement and its stubborn, generous, complicated people. She was falling in love with a way of life that her people had dismissed as primitive, and she was beginning to realize that everything she had been taught about humanity was wrong. New Horizon was changing her, one small kindness at a time, and she was starting to wonder if maybe that was not such a bad thing after all. The attack came on a cold autumn night when the leaves had turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and approaching winter. Valara was helping Danny clean the clinic when the first explosion shook the ground and sent bottles crashing from the shelves. For a moment, she thought it might be an earthquake, but then she heard the screaming and the sound of plasma weapons firing in the distance. Danny grabbed a medical bag and ran toward the door without hesitation. "Stay here," he shouted over his shoulder. But Valara was already following him into the chaos. The raiders were Vexari, a species of pirates and slavers who preyed on isolated colonies throughout the galaxy. They were tall and thin with gray skin stretched tight over sharp bones, and their eyes glowed red in the darkness like embers from a dying fire. There were dozens of them moving through the streets of New Horizon, setting buildings ablaze and cutting down anyone who tried to resist. Valara watched in horror as the peaceful settlement she had come to love transformed into a nightmare of fire and blood. She saw old Samuel fall with a plasma burn in his chest, still clutching the rifle he had grabbed to defend the children. She saw young mothers running with babies in their arms, while raiders laughed and gave chase. She saw everything she had learned to care about being destroyed by creatures who viewed these humans as nothing more than prey. Danny did not run or hide. He moved through the chaos like a man who had forgotten how to be afraid, pulling wounded people from burning buildings and dragging them to safety. His hands were burned and bleeding, and his face was black with smoke. But he did not stop. He could not stop, not while there were still people who needed him. Valara followed him, doing what she could to help, but she knew it was not enough. The Vexari were too many and too well armed, and the humans of New Horizon were simple farmers and shopkeepers who had never expected to fight a war. And then she heard the children screaming. Martha had gathered all the young ones in the community hall, a large wooden building in the center of town that served as a shelter during storms. But the Vexari had found them, and now a group of raiders was breaking down the doors while the children inside cried for help. Valara ran toward the building without thinking, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She arrived just as a Vexari soldier forced his way inside, his plasma rifle raised and his red eyes gleaming with cruel amusement behind him. Valara could see the terrified faces of children she knew by name. There was little Tommy, who always asked her questions about the stars. There was Maya, who had given her a flower just last week. There was a dozen others, all of them innocent and helpless and about to die. Something inside Valara broke open in that moment. All her life, she had hidden her powers. The psychic abilities of the ethery royal bloodline were closely guarded secrets, weapons of last resort that were never to be displayed before lesser species. Her father had taught her that revealing such gifts to humans would make the Empire appear threatening and invite conflict, but her father was not here, and these children were going to die. And Valar found that she did not care about politics or secrets anymore. She raised her hand and reached out with her mind. The Vexari soldier stopped mid-step, his body frozen in place as invisible force gripped him like a giant fist. He had time to make one small sound of surprise before Valara crushed the life out of him with a thought and let his body fall to the ground. The other raiders turned toward her with shock in their glowing eyes. They had expected easy prey, not an ethery princess with the power to kill. With her mind, Valara stood in the doorway of the community hall with violet light blazing from her eyes and her silver hair floating around her head like a crown of starlight. "Run," she said, and her voice echoed with power that made the air itself vibrate. The Vexari did not run. They raised their weapons and opened fire. But Valara was faster. She threw up a shield of pure psychic energy that stopped the plasma bolts in midair. And then she reached out and stopped the hearts of 3 raiders at once. The others finally understood that they were facing something far beyond their ability to fight, and they fled into the darkness with fear replacing the cruelty in their eyes. Valara wanted to chase them, wanted to make them pay for every person they had hurt, but the children were crying behind her, and she knew that vengeance could wait. She turned and knelt down among the little ones, checking each of them for injuries and speaking in soft tones until their tears began to slow. "It's okay," she told them. "You're safe now. I promise you're safe." Martha appeared in the doorway with blood on her hands and exhaustion in her eyes. And when she saw Valara kneeling among the children, she began to cry. The battle lasted another hour before the remaining Vexari retreated to their ships and fled into the sky. They had expected an easy target, and they had found something very different when dawn finally broke over New Horizon. The settlement was in ruins. Half the buildings had burned, and the streets were littered with debris, and the bodies of the fallen 7 humans had died defending their home, including old Samuel, who had been one of the first to welcome Valara to the community. Dozens more were wounded, some of them critically. Valara worked through the night and into the morning, using her powers to ease pain and accelerate healing in ways that ethery medicine had never been shared with outsiders. She was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. But she could not stop, not when Danny was still working, not when there were still people who needed help by midday. The worst of the wounded were stable, and Valara finally allowed herself to sit down in the ruins of the clinic. Danny sat beside her, his hands wrapped in bandages that she had applied herself. They did not speak for a long time. They did not need to. Finally, Danny turned to look at her with something in his eyes that she did not recognize at first. It took her a moment to realize it was respect. "You saved them," he said quietly. "Those kids would be dead without you, and a lot of other people too." Valara shook her head slowly. "I should have helped sooner," she said. "I should have done more." Danny laughed, and it was a tired sound but not an unhappy one. "That's what I say every time someone dies on my table," he replied. "Welcome to the club." Valara looked out at the ruined settlement and the people, who were already beginning to clean up and rebuild. She saw humans helping each other carry debris. She saw neighbors sharing food and water and words of comfort. She saw a community that had been knocked down but refused to stay fallen. "Why? Do they keep going?" she asked. "After everything, after all this loss, why do they not just give up?" Danny was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled. "Because that's what humans do," he said. "We get knocked down, and we get back up, and we keep going until there's nothing left to give. And sometimes we still find a little more after that." Valara nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand. She was beginning to see what made these short-lived creatures so remarkable. They did not have the power of the ethery or the technology or the long lifespans, but they had something else. They had a fire inside them that refused to go out no matter how hard the universe tried to extinguish it. And for the first time in her life, Valara wanted to be part of something like that. She stood up and offered Danny her hand. "Show me how to help rebuild," she said. He took her hand and pulled himself to his feet. And together they walked into the ruins of New Horizon to begin the long work of putting their home back together. The weeks after the raid were filled with hard work and slow healing. Valara threw herself into the rebuilding effort, alongside the humans of New Horizon, carrying lumber and mixing mortar and doing whatever needed to be done. Her hands, which had once been soft from a lifetime of luxury, grew rough with calluses. Her silver skin, which had always been protected from harsh light, darkened under the frontier sun. She barely recognized herself when she caught her reflection in the window. But somehow she did not mind. The communication relay had been damaged in the attack, but the settlers managed to repair it after 2 weeks of careful work. Valara stood before the console with her heart pounding and her hands trembling as she entered the codes that would reach the ethery homeworld. She had waited so long for this moment. She had dreamed of rescue and return, and the familiar comfort of crystal palaces and silk robes. The reply came 3 days later, and Valara read it alone in the small room that had become her home. The message was from her father's chief advisor, a cold man named Counselor Veth, who had always looked at her with barely hidden disdain. Words on the screen shattered everything she had ever believed about her place in the universe. Princess Valara Cathrion was officially declared dead. A memorial service had already been held in the great hall of the Imperial Palace. Her belongings had been distributed among her sisters, and new heir had been named to take her place in the line of succession, and most importantly, her survival was to remain a secret. The message explained that her rescue by humans was politically inconvenient if the galaxy learned that an ethery princess had been saved by the very species the Empire considered inferior. It would raise questions that the throne was not prepared to answer. Better for everyone. If Valara simply ceased to exist, there was no warmth in the message. There was no concern for her well-being or gratitude that she had survived. There was only cold political calculation from a father who had decided his daughter was worth more dead than Aliva. Valara sat with the message glowing on the screen for a very long time. She did not cry, she did not scream, she simply sat in perfect stillness while something inside her quietly died. When Danny found her that evening, she was sitting in the fields outside town, staring up at the stars with empty eyes. He did not ask what had happened. He simply sat down beside her in the tall grass and waited. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, comfortable in a way that Valara had never experienced with anyone from her own species. Finally, she began to talk. She told him about the message and her father's betrayal and the realization that she had been discarded like a broken tool that was no longer useful. She told him about her childhood and her sisters and the endless loneliness of a life spent surrounded by people who only valued her for her bloodline. She told him things she had never admitted even to herself, secrets and fears and hopes that she had buried so deep she had forgotten they existed. Danny listened without interrupting, and when she finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. Sounds like your family never deserved you, he said. Simply. Valara laughed. But it was a broken sound that held no joy. They are the imperial family of the Ethereal Empire, she replied. They rule 1,000 star systems and have shaped galactic history for 40,000 years. Danny shrugged. Doesn't mean they deserve you, he said. Titles and power don't make someone worth loving, and from what you've told me, they never saw you as anything more than a piece in their political games. Valara felt tears begin to fall down her silver cheek. She had not cried since she was a small child, and the sensation was strange and frightening. I do not know who I am anymore, she whispered. I was a princess of the Ethereal Empire, and now I am nothing. Danny turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his eyes held a warmth that made her chest ache. You're not nothing, he said firmly. You're the woman who fought raiders to protect children you barely knew. You're the healer who worked through the night to save people your empire considers inferior. You're a friend to everyone in this settlement who has gotten to know you. He paused and reached out to take her hand in his. Worth isn't something that gets given to you by emperors or bloodlines, he continued. It's something you build through what you choose to do, and from where I'm sitting, you've built quite a lot. Valara looked at their hands joined together, silver and brown, alien and human, and she felt something crack open in her heart. I do not deserve your kindness, she said quietly. Danny smiled. Maybe not, he replied. But you're getting it anyway. That's how this works. She began to cry in earnest then. Great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Danny pulled her close and held her while she wept. And he did not let go even when her tears soaked through his shirt. She cried. For the father who had abandoned her and the sisters who had never loved her, she cried. For the lonely girl who had spent centuries pretending she did not need anyone, she cried for all the years she had wasted hating humans when they were capable of more compassion than her own people had ever shown her. When her tears finally stopped, she felt empty, but somehow lighter, as if she had set down a burden she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten it was there. What do I do now? She asked in a voice that was raw from crying. Danny helped her sit up and handed her a handkerchief from his pocket. Whatever you want, he said. You're not a princess anymore, which means you're free in a way you've never been before. So the question is, what do you want to do with that freedom? Valara thought about the question for a long time. She thought about the crystal palaces she would never see again and the family that had thrown her away. She thought about the people of New Horizon who had welcomed her despite every reason to hate her. She thought about Danny Carter, who had lost everything because of her people's cruelty and still found the strength to be kind. I want to stay, she said finally. I want to help these people. I want to learn what it means to be part of a community that cares about each other. I want to find out who I am when I am not defined by a title I never asked for. Danny smiled, and it was the warmest expression she had ever seen on any face. That sounds like a good start, he said. They sat together in the field until the sun began to rise. And when they finally walked back to the settlement, something had changed between them. Valara did not have a word for what she was feeling, but it felt like hope. It felt like coming home. It felt like the beginning of something new. The people of New Horizon did not ask about the message, or the tears, or the long night in the field. They simply welcomed her back with smiles and cups of tea and small acts of kindness that meant more to her than all the treasures of the imperial vaults. She was no longer Princess Valara Kethrun, third daughter of Emperor Kethrun the Ninth. She was just Valara now, and somehow that felt like the greatest gift she had ever received. The seasons changed, and the months became years, and Valara built a life she had never imagined possible. She worked alongside Danny in the clinic, learning the simple human art of healing with hands and herbs rather than technology. She taught the children of New Horizon about the stars. sharing knowledge that her people had hoarded for millennia. She celebrated holidays she did not understand and mourned losses that broke her heart and laughed at jokes that once would have seemed beneath her dignity. She learned to cook, though she was terrible at it. And Danny teased her mercilessly every time she burned dinner. She learned to dance at the autumn festival, awkward and clumsy among humans who moved with a joy she had never seen in the formal bowls of the imperial court. She learned what it meant to belong somewhere. Truly belong, not because of blood or title, but because people had chosen to welcome her into their lives, and somewhere along the way, without quite realizing when it happened, she fell in love with Danny Carter. It was not the dramatic passion of the old HFY stories, all fire and tragedy and doomed romance across the stars. It was quiet and gentle and built on 1,000 small moments. It was the way he made her tea, without being asked. It was the way he listened when she talked about her past, without judgment. It was the way he looked at her like she was a miracle even on the days when she felt like a disaster. She never told him how she felt, and he never told her either. But somehow they both knew some things did not need words. The HFY ship appeared in orbit 3 years after Valara's supposed death, and when the message came through the communication relay, she assumed it was another cold dismissal from her father's court. But the voice on the recording was not. Counselor vetted was a woman named Admiral Sarah, leader of a reformist faction that had been growing in power since the old emperor fell ill. Admiral Sarah explained that everything had changed. Emperor Kethrian IX had died 6 months ago, and the succession had thrown the empire into chaos. Valara's oldest sister now sat on the throne, but her rule was contested by those who believed the empire needed to change its ways. The reformists wanted peace with humanity. They wanted to share knowledge and technology and build bridges instead of walls, and they had learned that Princess Valara Kethrian was alive, living among the very species the reformists believed could teach the HFY something valuable. They wanted her to come home. They wanted her to become an ambassador, a living symbol of what was possible when HFY and humans chose understanding over hatred. Valara listened to the message 3 times before she believed it was real. She walked through the streets of New Horizon in a daze, not sure what to feel or think or want. The future she had accepted as impossible was suddenly within reach, but reaching for it meant leaving behind everyone and everything she loved. Danny found her sitting on the hill where his wife and daughter were buried, looking out over the settlement as the sun began to set. He sat beside her without speaking, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. "They want me to go back," she said quietly. "I heard," he replied. "They want me to be an ambassador, to change things, to help my people see humans the way I see them now." Danny nodded slowly. "That sounds important," he said, and his voice was carefully neutral in a way that told her he was trying very hard not to influence her decision. Valara closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of the frontier world that had become her home. "I do not want to leave," she admitted. "I have been happier here than I ever was in the Crystal Palaces, and I am afraid that if I go back, I will lose everything I have found." Danny was quiet for a long moment. "You won't lose it," he finally said. "What you learned here, what you became, that's part of you now, and nothing can take it away. Not politics or distance, or all the years between now and whenever we see each other again." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Will there be a whenever?" she asked. Danny smiled, and it was the same warm expression that had first made her feel safe on a world full of strangers. "I'll be here," he said simply. "New Horizon isn't going anywhere, and neither am I, so you go change the galaxy. And when you need to remember why you're doing it, you come back and I'll make you that terrible tea you pretend to like." Valara laughed through her tears and threw her arms around him. He held her close, and for a long moment, they simply stayed that way. Two people from different worlds who had found something precious in each other. The colony threw a celebration on her last night, the biggest party New Horizon had ever seen there. was music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. The children she had taught about the stars made her a card with drawings of the constellations. Martha gave her a handmade blanket to keep her warm on cold nights in space, and Danny gave her a small wooden carving he had made himself. A clumsy representation of an ethery flower. It was rough and imperfect and clearly made by hands more suited to healing than art. Valara treasured it more than any jewel from the imperial vaults. "It's beautiful," she told him. "It's terrible," he replied with a laugh. "But it's the best I could do." She kissed his cheek and tucked the carving into her pocket, where it would stay for the rest of her very long life. When the ethery ship descended the next morning, the whole settlement came out to say goodbye. Valara stood before them in simple human clothing, her silver skin weathered by years of frontier sun, and she spoke from her heart. "You taught me that humanity is not what my people believed," she said. "You are stubborn and emotional and reckless and so impossibly short-lived, but you are also brave and kind and forgiving in ways that put my ancient civilization to shame." She looked at Danny and smiled. "I'm going back to change my people," she continued. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life building bridges between our worlds. And when the historians write about how the ethery finally learned to see humans as equals, they will trace it back to this small settlement on the edge of known space." She paused and blinked back tears. "They will trace it back to a medic who found a stranger in the wreckage of a ship and chose to save her life. Not because of what she could give him, but because that is simply who he is." The ship carried her away from New Horizon and into a future full of challenges. She could not yet imagine she would spend decades fighting to change hearts and minds. Across 1,000 star systems, she would face enemies who called her a traitor and allies who doubted her sincerity. She would grow tired and frustrated and sometimes wonder if any of it was worth the cost. But whenever she lost her way, she would take out the small wooden carving and remember the human who had shown her that true nobility had nothing to do with blood. The galaxy changed because one man chose mercy over hatred, and that, she would tell anyone who listened, was the most human thing of all. Years later, when the first official treaty of friendship was signed between the Ethery Empire and the Human Alliance, Valara returned to New Horizon. Danny was older now, his brown hair streaked with gray and his face lined by time. But his smile was exactly the same. She ran to him and he caught her in his arms. And the whole settlement cheered. "Welcome home," he said, and finally, after all her travels across the stars, Valara knew exactly what that word meant.